start right now. Thank you all for being here. Thank anyone who's watching remotely at a later time too. It's really hard at this point in the semester to be showing up and concentrating, especially when it's not a real seminar. So I'm grateful to you all for being here. Nice to see your faces or your names. And I'm just going to launch right into this. Now, I know that you've gathered this by now. Am I an enthusiast by nature? Yes, I'm an enthusiast by nature. I love literature. And when we were teaching poetry, I said, oh my gosh, I love teaching poems more than I love teaching anything else. And then we got to plays and I said, plays are so special to teach. They're just the best. However, I will now say we're back in the world of fiction, and the world of prose fiction is my true home, my intellectual and aesthetic home. And I have been immersed in this world of storytelling since I was a very, very young and voracious and compulsive reader. I read novels that are escapist. This past year, I've pretty much read only the silliest novels of the kind that come under the category paranormal romance, that have werewolves and vampires and crime scenes and stuff like that. I just can't concentrate on anything substantive. But I've also spent a lot of time really, really reading and thinking about serious fiction and storytelling. So I am super excited. I feel like I came home today. Coming to fiction makes me feel like I came home. And I'm looking forward to sharing some thoughts with you. I will really only talk about the title story of the collection today. I'm amenable to doing some other kind of conversation if others do want to talk about the other two stories. So we might be in touch by email about that later. But let me launch for now. And I can tell you this lecture, we will take a break in the middle because I think I've probably got enough material that I'll need all of the time. The lecture has 3 parts, and I'll give you those headers and tell you as we reach them so that you have a sense of where we are. The first part comes under the header narration and voice. The second part comes under the heading structure, patterns, models. And the third part of the lecture comes under the heading intertexts. So let me get started by sharing some thoughts on narration and voice, first in a general sense, and then as we might begin to talk about them in the particular story. So when I talk about narration, I'm not talking about the plot of the story or the content of the story. I'm really focusing on the way that the story is told, the words that the story is told in, the choices that some kind of a narrator, sometimes it's a person. I write in the first person about the incidents that happened to me, a private detective solving a crime in Seattle in the 1990s, right? So, you can narrate a story in the first person with the narrator being the person who the story happened to. You could also have that same story, underlying story of the private investigator told in what I will call not just third person narration, but there's something particular, a subcategory called third person limited narration, which is to say it's a third person narration that is really quite similar to first person narration in the sense that it's really, we're always with the main character, we're seeing things through their point of view and so forth. So it's narrated in the first person, but you can, in the third person, but you can think of that first person voice and the third person being sort of twinned in some sense or having some special affinities. So the field of study that concerns narration and how we talk about it is sometimes called narrative theory or alternately narratology. And in narratology, as I've already begun to suggest, it's really important to be able to talk precisely about the distinction between the events of the story, the incidents that take place, and the medium in which it is narrated, which is to say that batch of words through which we get that story mediated, sometimes completely out of chronological order in pieces that have surprising juxtapositions and jumping around and so forth, right? So you start to see the utility of having a concept that differentiates between those two modes. You could think of them loosely corresponding to content and form, with us here in this particular class being very, very interested in form and how the form contributes to the impact of the story that is recounted. You might have heard the term omniscient narrator at some point in your life as an aspiring or journeyman literary critic. So that term omniscient, it is a funny one. It does come from 17th century theology. A lot of the concepts that we have for this stuff come out of that era of sort of birth of Enlightenment thought that you learn about in CC, so to speak. The thinkers that have Descartes and Spinoza and Locke and people thinking about mind and theories of mind and how we know things, all of that sort of stuff. So omniscient is a word that comes out of a theological context. It is the description in Christian theology of God. God knows everything, and omniscient is the Latin term that's used that. In the 20th century, though, I think it may have been E.M. Forster who realized it first. At any rate, it came into relatively common usage for talking about fictional narrators. And so remember I said that you could have a first person and a third person limited that were quite similar because it's the story of the private investigator, either in her own words or in a perspective that's very close to her. That third person limited is more like first person narration than it is like the kind of third person narration that we would call third person omniscient, where we have lots of different storylines and there is a kind of bird's eye view narrator who might sometimes even have a little bit of an I persona. Like there's an I, but it's a disembodied I. It's not like a person like the private investigator. And it probably only makes its presence felt very sporadically among many, many long pages of stretches where we really are in this omniscient third person mode that lets the author move around, you know, to different characters who don't know each other. And there's a sort of global perspective. And two very famous novels in the British literary tradition that come under this category would be Henry Fielding's Tom Jones and George Eliot's Middlemarch. And if you like reading long novels, those are two that I recommend. I think they're both probably more enjoyably read in a class context than just on your own. I wouldn't say that they're like a page turner that you're going to devour from start to finish, but really extraordinary novels that will teach you a lot about how narration works, which is something that's important to know about if you want to write about fiction, or if you want to write fiction yourself. Reading as wide a range of possible kinds of narration will be really valuable for you. So think of the grammatical tables. I was too lazy to do any kind of chart. You're just going to have to imagine it, right? So we've got first person, second person, third person. I'll do it actually mirror image, right? First, second, third. If you've learned a foreign language, that's probably where you can picture these tables from. And then in the first column, we have singular. In the next column, we have plural. So we've talked about first person singular narration, I. Third person. There are quite a lot of novels in recent years narrated in the second person, you. It's often a you that really is more like an I. You know, it's the depressive narrator, like you open the bathroom cabinet and pull out the Percocet that was left over from your mother's wisdom tooth surgery or whatever, right? Like, so it's a you that is signaling an I, but it could really be a you, a formally innovative way of narrating a story, like you do this, you do that. And we certainly can go into the plural forms as well. The plural, the first person plural is the one that you see. Again, it's a little bit of a stunt narration. Novels that are written in you, I think Bret Easton Ellis, Less Than Zero is the canonical example of the you, the disaffected, jaded you narration. But I can certainly think of 3 or 4 novels at least of the last couple decades, and there must be really hundreds if there are that many I can just think of, that are narrated in we. A well-known one would be Karen Joy Fowler's book, The Jane Austen Book Club, where it's the we of the group of people who are the members of the book club who narrates. Ed Park's novel Personal Days would be another example, the collective we of an office in a company that's about to lay everybody off, so it's all about kind of group and collective identity. So just remember how when I said plays don't have narrators, and then you were all posting in the comments all the examples of the plays that do, right? So most fiction that we read is probably narrated in first or third person, but there is no limit on what you can do in narration. And again, if you like writing fiction, you might try out some of those other less natural modes. You can get interesting, especially psychological effects with those. So I think I've used the phrase authorial persona for this I that is not an I. So in omniscient narration, when that I comes in George Eliot's Middlemarch, for instance, you know, that I has certainly something in common with the figure of the author, with wisdom, knowledge, experience, you know, things like that. But the narrator of Middlemarch is not the author, George Eliot. There is a disembodied narrative I who might be thought of as a kind of authorial persona, like a kind of stand-in for the writer. Fielding's Tom Jones has that even more strongly. This is often present in omniscient narration, in the sense that omniscient narration can be sort of transparent or invisible, like you're never aware that there even is a medium that it's being narrated in, but it often also can have this more intrusive kind of authorial persona. Or you might think of a book like War and Peace that has these disquisitions on history that are there alongside the storytelling. The narrative theorist Gérard Genette wrote an influential piece circa 1970 or so, where he noticed how odd it is that from the very earliest fictional narratives we have, and I would ask you to think, let's say, of the Odyssey, right? The Odyssey is a good example. It's verse rather than prose. It's definitely not a novel, and novel doesn't really emerge as a historical category meaningfully until the 18th century in Europe, right? You would call it probably just a prose fiction before, you know, prose fiction or a fiction in verse or a romance or this, that, and the other. Odyssey, we probably are still calling an epic poem, but think of the Odyssey. I know a lot of you have read it. So in the Odyssey, there are parts where there is a narrator who is probably an omniscient narrator. There are parts where there is an authorial persona who comes in. That's in the invocations to the muses that you get at the beginning of some of the books, right? Where the voice of the poet comes in. But the poet isn't like a person who's a character in the story telling the story in the first person. It's really distinct from that. And then there is also, interestingly, and this is the oddity that Genette wanted us to see with fresh eyes, there are also long stretches where the words on the page are not the voice of a narrator, but are the words that are spoken by characters in the story. And he wants us to look at that and see how strange it is. Like, how crazy is that you can just switch effortlessly and have people understand that some of the words are quoted speech that characters said, and some of the words appertain to some disembodied narrator, you know, who isn't present as a character in the story. He says that we should think of it as being as strange. Again, if you've taken art home, or maybe you just are a person who likes art, think of the 17th century still life paintings, you know, Vermeer et al., a bowl of fruit on a table with very beautiful light on it and so forth, really realistically rendered. Genette says it's as strange that in the Odyssey, you can have unmediated speech and you can have mediated narration right next to each other. It's as strange as if you had one of those landscape paintings and like an actual piece of fruit was glued onto the flat landscape of the painted canvas. Like it's that level of a representational difference, because the words that the characters say, when I say them again, they are the exact words that the character said. Yes, I know it's fiction. Whereas the narration, that's words that came from somewhere ineffable and different that was never the words a person just said. In the story that we're going to think about together today, the narrator and the narrative voice is supremely important. I'm going to go through a series of points. About midway through that list, we'll read the first paragraph of the story together so that you'll see more clearly and concretely what I'm talking about. So you now have enough background from my mini lecture and opening that you will understand when I say this narrator is not a person. This is not a personalized narrator. It is an impersonal narrator in the sense that we use that term to talk about a narrator who isn't a person in the story, right? So it's an impersonal narrator, but impersonal is also very misleading because this narrator is not impersonal in the ordinary sense of the word. This narrator is extremely invested in the story that they are telling. There are intense emotional affects, especially around anger, this barely controlled rage. I could say this narrative voice, this narrator, is fiercely intelligent and passionate and devastated by not just the individual incident that the story describes, but by the fact that it corresponds to a type of incident that is so terribly, terribly familiar to the narrator and to all of us as well. Here's the next point. One of the ways that we have a sense of the narrator is by their cultural frame of reference. Now, how do we distinguish between a narrator and an author? You could certainly say to me, or make an argument based on a couple different stories, the voice of the narrator of this story, though it's an impersonal narrator, is so close to the essayistic first-person voice of Nafissa Thompson-Spires, the author, that it might be productive to think of the closeness between those two things. It's more likely, though, that you would want to acknowledge that closeness and then start to think about what the fact that it isn't a personalized narrator really changes about the meaning of the story or the impact that it has on us. So as to say, the author has clearly drawn on her own body of cultural references in order to create the cultural world that is brought to life so clearly in the story. The 90s culture, the cosplay, the anime, obviously the author must be, in this case we could guess, is somewhat pretty invested in that stuff too. But it's not being conjured up in the way that in a first-person non-fictional essay the author Nafissa Thompson-Spires might put it together. It is brought together and amassed in order to create this amazing kind of a network. And you can think of the narrative voice sort of, it both is the network and it's kind of floating above the network, right? It's the medium through which all of our perceptions are filtered, the only way that we have access to knowledge. So terminology, I say the author, her name is Nafissa Thompson-Spires. She is an actual person. I think I said I hoped I might be able to get her to come to class today, but she just had major surgery last week, so she could not come to class. So that we've got the author, Thompson-Spires. Conventional, as you probably know, but might not, in literary criticism, we're usually just using the author's last name once we said their full name once, Thompson-Spires. Then we've got an unnamed impersonal narrator of the story, who, right, no name there. Couldn't really say that this narrator has a gender or an age or an identity, except that you could say this narrator, this narrator does, I think, have a race. And then we could start going into little details in the story to think about whether we can then put the narrator in some kind of an age range by way of the temporal orientation towards the 90s, right? I don't think it will be productive to drive those questions into the ground, but if you're becoming a more sophisticated reader of fiction, you get better and better at just picking all this stuff up almost effortlessly as you're reading. And then what we hope you learn in a class like this is how to then put those observations that take place almost at an unconscious level into some clear descriptive sentences that would convey it to somebody else who didn't have access to that text. So The story is also a web of allusions. There are cultural references, and there are also other kinds of allusion. That's allusion, and I will say more about that under the header of intertext below. So as to say, there are several other literary works that are important ones as the intertextual companions for this story, the other texts that this one writes itself into a relationship with in ways that we can extrapolate from the story. This is relatively easy for us in this case because Thompson-Spires gives us the actual names. She doesn't just quote a phrase. She gives us enough help that we can figure out where to go and get those things. So one of these things is this body of 19th century African-American periodicals that are the prose sketches that are these sort of satirical, distanced descriptions, of different character types and so forth in Black society. That is one set of intertexts. 3 different authors are named. Another pair of important intertexts that we get late in the story are the poem by Donica Kelly that I want to end with, and the Flannery O'Connor story, Everything That Rises Must Converge, which I'm certain a lot of you will have read, and which I think really I might put on the syllabus itself next time, along with the Kelly poem, so that you would all really have access to those right there together. So let me share my screen, and we're going to go through the first paragraph of the story, and I'll start to give you a little bit more of the feel of the texture of what we are doing when we read this sort of thing. I think I've organized all my stuff pretty well. Okay, good. So you might remember me when I was talking about poetry at the beginning of the semester, saying that the most amazing thing about poems is, as opposed to other genres, is that every word has to be placed absolutely perfectly, that it was chosen and it's right. It's in a place where it creates meaning. One of the things that I like about these Thompson-Spires short stories is that she has a poet's sense of precision with language. There is no word or phrase or sentence here that is not deliberate and controlled and there to make an effect. So let me read this for you now, and I'll put a little bit more of the affective or emotional tone into it as I read it, but we can go back through afterwards and think about what I based that interpretation on. Riley wore blue contact lenses and bleached his hair, which he worked with gel and a blow dryer and a flat iron some mornings into Sonic the Hedgehog spikes, so stiff you could prick your finger on them. Oh, was that some? Can you still hear me?
We can hear you.
I can hear you. Good. Just checking. I got some sound there that made me worried that something wasn't working right. Okay, let me get my screen back up. Okay. Sonic the Hedgehog spikes, so stiff you could prick your finger on them, and sometimes into a wispy side-swooped bob with long bangs. And he was black. But this wasn't any kind of a self-hatred thing. He'd read The Bluest Eye and Invisible Man in school, and even picked up Disgruntled at a book fair. And yes, they were good, and there was some resonance in those books for him, but this story isn't about race or the shame of being alive or any of those things. He was not self-hating. He was even listening to Drake, though you could make it Fetty Wap if his appreciation for trap music changes something for you, because all that's relevant here is that he wasn't against the music of his people or anything like that, as he walked down Figueroa with his earbuds pushed in just far enough so as not feel itchy. So I want you to imagine that when we are in this context of third-person narration, there's an implicit I here, but we really don't. We don't have a person narrating it, right? There's an orientation and a mood and a voice or a tone without there being like the I of the narrator right here. So those first words, they are straight descriptive words. Riley wore blue contact lenses and bleached his hair. And then we get this wonderful elaboration between those things that are called M dashes, right? Sometimes he works it into Sonic the Hedgehog spikes. very non-naturalistic, also blue, I know. So you get a funny, it's not just the blue contact lenses, it's a vision briefly of blue hair there too. Sometimes into wispy side swoop bob with long bangs, right? Real love for language and for the vision of the elaborate hairdos that Riley likes to put together for himself. And then the sort of still factual last sequence of words in the sentence, and he was black. And think of the place that this is narrated from. Let's call it a kind of middle distance. It's not so far away that omniscient really sees, like it's not the bird's eye view, utterly global. We're close in to a person, and already in the aside between the dashes, there's a little bit of a sense that these are words that Riley himself might use, right? Wispy side swoop bob with long bangs, right? You know, that this is Riley's self-awareness maybe of his own hair. But then with the next sentence, we move much, much closer into Riley's point of view. So this is something, we won't talk about it a ton. It may not be a super useful term in this context, but there's a phrase that's called free indirect style or free indirect speech. That's essentially an effect that you can get in third person narration, where the narrator from the middle distance sort of swoops in on the individual consciousness, and it's not direct speech or style. It's not quoted words that the person is saying or even quoted thoughts. It's that somehow some string of phrases or manner of speaking or even just stylistic hint has somehow magically migrated from the consciousness of the character into the feel of the third person prose, right? But this wasn't any kind of self-hatred thing. The narrator says that, but it's based not very remotely on a kind of underlying notional sentence that we don't get, right? You can imagine Riley saying, this isn't any kind of self-hatred thing, right? So the words have migrated into the third person, and it produces this really amazing effect where we both have the power of an external narrator who can understand and see things the character can't, and we can get the real vividness and particularity of the language that we use inside our own heads when we're thinking about ourselves. Here are some more references. Very famous and influential novels about race by Toni Morrison, by Ralph Ellison, etc. And look how close all of this language is to the way that we might imagine Riley talking about himself. Yeah, they're good and all. There might be, you know, there's some resonance and all, and then as we go into the second part, now we really did swoop back out. Now we're at the middle distance again, right? So there's this extraordinary ease with which we move from the narrative voice in the middle distance into the character's consciousness, pulling out that language that is so vivid about themselves and gives conveys the texture of their thoughts and their words, and then come right back out to the power of a narrator saying something that Riley can't. This story isn't about race or the shame of being alive or any of those things, right? Whatever expectation you might have built up, you were wrong. The narrator is pushing into our awareness to say that. And look how playful and ironic and self-distancing the narrative voice then still is, right? He was even listening to Drake. Anybody who's taken a fiction workshop has heard the advice, you know, use vivid detail, like tell the particular and the concrete rather than the general. So it's as if the narrator is saying, you know, I know how to tell a good story. I need to give you like a real actual soundtrack that you can imagine. And the point of singling out Drake is like that Riley isn't listening to white people's music, right? Like that he's listening to Black music. He's not self-hating. But look how unwilling the narrator is to stay limited, even for a sentence, to the realistic rendering where you flesh out the context of the sights and the smells and the sounds and the colors and so forth. What the narrator then says after this dash aside again, the narrator actually doesn't care what music Riley was listening to. This is not the kind of story where it matters to be able to hear the song in the way that, if imagine this as a scene in a movie where we would want to hear the song, you already would be in trouble if you were doing a film adaptation of this, because the point is that we are in this sort of meta world, right? The narrator isn't going to be bothered to give you real historical details, because this is a story that makes a point, that is making an argument, rather than having its primary pleasures be in the richness and vividness of the world that is realized, right? So this is the narrator speaking to us, the reader. Could make it this, if that changes something for you, because all that's relevant here, you hear how that's the language of argument rather than storytelling. He wasn't against the music of his people or anything like that. And then back to this scene that where we're observing sort of from close by, like imagine the camera being kind of just a little bit behind his head, like we're seeing the earbud, right? Walking down the street with his earbuds pushed in. There's a sequel line in the next paragraph. I won't read it in its entirety, but I want to pull a little bit more of this here, because this story really, so to speak, wears its heart on its sleeve. We know right away that it is the narrator of this story who is the voice that we will feel close to, rather than it being the character that we're going to come close to or identify and so forth. That something is going on at the storytelling level here that we're being asked to pay attention to. Look at this direct address. We saw, right, if that changes something for you, there, this impersonal narrator is comfortable addressing the reader in the second person. And look at how vivid a voice then is coming through from the narrator as well. Look, if I say, and yes, there are black people who have both of those things naturally, we can move past the whole phenotypically this or biologically that discussion. We can say a lot of the things about the narrator based on that sentence. This is a hyper smart, hyper educated narrator who is angry and annoyed about a lifetime of having to sort of explain, perhaps especially to white people, that there is a very wide range of people who are black. It can mean all sorts of different things, right? You hear the impatience, the anger just below the surface. We're moving past that. And then here are the sentences that I wanted to put as the sequel to the previous. And if there is something meta in this narrator's consciousness and self-consciousness, or this overindulgent aside, it isn't meta for the sake of being meta. This narrator's consciousness is just letting you know about said consciousness up front, like a raised black fist, to get the close reading out of the way and make space for Riley, back to the particular, who was the kind of black man for whom blue eyes and blonde hair were not natural. Now we get back to the story. So meta meaning next level, from a level above. There is something meta here, and we are being told up front. This is not just apolitical language games of the style that you might associate with a novelist like Italo Calvino, somebody like that. It's not meta for the sake of being meta. An interesting, amazing use of consciousness in the next part, because when we talk about narration, consciousness, we're talking about Jane Austen or Henry James, and consciousness is very much about like theory of mind, Lockean identity, consciousness. It's a very, frankly, it comes out of the tradition of white philosophical thought that is strongly associated with the Enlightenment. And in narrative theory, it's still a very kind of Enlightenment term, thinking about knowledge. But think about that other sense of consciousness that comes out of 60s radicalism. Ever heard of the phrase consciousness raising groups, right? Consciousness was the thing that Marxist and Black Power and other kinds of radical activist groups sought. And so there's an amazing shift where the consciousness that's like knowledge and perspectives and narration somehow is transformed by that word use into an explicitly political consciousness that is then elaborated with the comparison to the raised black fist, that very well-known image of the Black Power salute that is showed graphically. I haven't pasted it in, but I think many of you will know it already. Okay, let me stop sharing. And I've got just one more point there. Yeah, actually, it was still in the quote, but I'll just share it with you in my words. There is so much awareness in these two paragraphs that I have hardly made space for Riley. So the I of the impersonal narrator is right there. We almost start to, I'm very tempted to say she rather than they, although I'm going to keep on saying they, right? This is an angry Black narrator, probably a woman or possibly a woman, although it's not really meaningful to talk about a narrator perhaps having any kind of a gender. So this is an incredibly self-aware, smart, angry, political narrator who has to kind of tell themselves to back down and back off, to leave a little bit of space for Riley, whose tastes are then elaborated in the last part of that sentence as really being, he liked cosplay and all of these things in manga and anime, which is a charming personal detail, not particularly stereotypical, and is also an important sort of plot point for establishing how he comes to be in the place he is in this particular set of circumstances. So 446, that was the end of my first section. And I'm counting the time. Yeah, maybe we take a few minutes break now. Let's come back at 5:50. You can take 4 minutes. I'll just stay here if anybody has any questions or wants to chat.
Hi, it's Erica.
Hi, Erica. How are you doing?
I'm good. So that reminds me of Tiny. She's married to Ti. She's they're they're hip hop royalty, and he's a businessman as well as a politically conscious guy. He's always up on the hill, advocating for the arts, but black arts, and but she being his mate, she went to Africa as deeply enthralled and involved as she is, and they've had this, reality show about their hip hop life. She went to Africa and had her eyes surgically. She had the cornea surgically removed and had blue eyes surgically placed on her eyes. So that's the first thing I thought of. Said, yeah,
it's pretty extraordinary, right? Or and the reference to the Morrison, the bluest eye in the opening that's a really important other intertext for us.
Yes, that's exactly what I thought about. I thought of Tiny. So yeah. I thought that was pretty powerful.
Yeah, I'm so in love with these stories. I just think I remember I read the book and it was just electrifying. It's so good.
I haven't read The Bluest Eye in a while, but I remember how it was very impactful. I mean, I definitely remember it, and I'd like to have time to read it.
Me too. I haven't read it since I was a lot younger than I am now either.
Yeah, Toni Morrison's very, very impactful. And when you talked about how it would be difficult to take this and turn it into some kind of movie or something, it reminds me of the difficulty that they had with Beloved, which I didn't think they did successfully. I mean, they did as well as they could, but I mean, it's very hard to capture stream of consciousness, and
they can't capture the narration and the presence of the supernatural that's so beautifully and delicately handled in the book.
Right.
It kind of just, it's not so much,
It doesn't work. I mean, I know they did the best they could, but it's almost like a losing game.
A little bit. You're setting yourself up to fail when you're doing it. It's not that it may well be worth doing. I'm sure it brought people to the book who wouldn't have read it otherwise, but I don't think you could say that film adaptation matches the level of the novel from which it's adapted.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I was reminded of when reading this was Zadie Smith speaking in tongues. Just these first couple of paragraphs, just because I feel like from like right off the bat, the author is saying this is who Riley was, even though it doesn't like follow along with what you stereotypically believe a Black man to be. This is who he was, and unfortunately, because this is how the world is, we need to get this out of the way in the beginning and tell you it's not because he hates himself. It's not because of all these other beliefs. It's not because he only likes whatever they said, white women and Asian women, what they said later on. You know, it's just who he was as a person, and it's okay that as a Black man, he doesn't have to follow these stereotypes that are forced on the Black community.
Yeah.
So I found these first couple of paragraphs I found to be extremely moving.
Yeah. Zadie Smith would be another interesting person to teach. That maybe that piece would be the good one to assign in a sort of cluster with this. Everything is up for grabs. Okay, I'm going to get back into this. So now we are on the topic of structure. I wouldn't say that paying attention to structure is nearly as important as paying attention to narration. Like I'll love it if now when you're reading any kind of fiction, you're just kind of in the back of your head noticing some things about the narrative voice and so forth. That I think really is valuable. Some books don't really call for it. I mean, you know, the classic airport thriller doesn't really invite you to read in that kind of way. But if you're reading things for class, etc., reading interesting things for fun. But so structure, I don't think is as important as narration, and yet it is another very important formal component. So I'm going to go ahead and now say some things about structure that will take us further into and more fully through the story. So again, Thompson-Spires makes it pretty easy for us. She gives us numbered sections, and she has a second, and there are 6 sections, and she has another little tool she uses, the 3 asterisks in a row, that can mark a division within a section so as to divide a first part or mode of a section from a second part that is in a somewhat different mode. And we'll look at the final one in the last part of class as our example of that. So in some sense, this extraordinary story is really focusing on a very simple and all too familiar theme, a brief, casual encounter between 2 Black men on the street, very low-key, low-stakes, minor violence that ends with police officers shooting 2 Black men to death. That is the story that's described. Although, as Megan was suggesting, in the language right up from the front, everything that the narrator is doing is not letting us relax into lazy thinking that says this is a stereotype, you know, these are people we're not interested in. The particularity of Riley, the fact that he can have, so to speak, white tastes without being self-hating, you know, the insistence that every person has a right to like what they like and that it doesn't always have to be political, like, you know, so that is there to counter the sense of this being a mythic story that happens again and again and is almost sometimes undifferentiated when we think about it en masse. The particularity of these individuals in this story is something that the narrator wants to bring home. So what is this encounter? Riley is young, white collar. He resents being singled out for his race from the other cosplayers. Brother Man, Richard Simmons, as we learned his real name is, Brother Man resents Riley not kind of responding to his gesture of outreach in a way he doesn't resent the white cosplayers not responding to his outreach. But Riley too is grumpy that he has to, that this is expected of him just because of his race. And in one of the narrator's classic ironic phrases, the narrator says, even that Riley's decision not to respond, kind of the split-second decision not to respond, might even be an exercise in method acting, right? Method acting, the school of acting where, you know, a lot of famous Hollywood actors like to do this now, where like, if you're going to be a character shipwrecked on an island, you go and shipwreck yourself on an island and lose 50 pounds because there's only, you know, water and breadfruit or something like that. So an exercise in method acting, he's playing this this anime figure of this elite Japanese schoolboy who's kind of aloof and cosmopolitan and so forth. So maybe it's method acting that meant that he didn't respond to Brother Man's kind of call for recognition. We get a continued play as Thompson-Spires, as the narrator continues to tell this story, a continued sensitivity to the ways in which Riley is himself quite sensitive about being charged with not being Black enough. His Blackness is suspect for various reasons, including his hair and his blue contact lenses. And the great detail that I love here that I'll just remind you of, the narrator tells us that the Japanese schoolboy character that Riley is playing would say fisticuffs for the interaction where they start punching at each other. But Riley in everyday life, this is the narrator, would have simply said they got to scrapping, right? So the narrator can move between those different vocabularies and mediate them for us, show us Riley as someone who is himself very capable of code switching, of operating in a lot of different linguistic and cultural milieus. And as the two men come physically together and start to get scrapping or punching each other, you know, the physical contact begins. Passers-by start to film the altercation. This is the sentence that the narrator gives us: sharply, dryly sardonic and devastated. The people who watched and filmed and circulated the scene from inside one of the lobbies of the convention center said it was just like Naruto v. Pain, right? These observers are heartless. They're just gripped by their eyes. They're voyeuristic. They're in the scene. It's just like a fight out of anime. And then this devastating, sardonic line that comes from the narrator. Maybe the narrator is reporting a kind of caricatured, ignorant statement of those viewers, only with two Black guys, so you couldn't tell if either one was the hero. Remember I talked about free and direct speech at the beginning, that we went so close into Riley, had a little bit of his language. Here too, it's like we're in the consciousness of those callow, racist observers. We're in their consciousness, but somehow their phrase, their callow, ignorant words migrate into the third person narration in a way that becomes highly satirical and that puts it into a place of critique rather than of unthinking quotation. So the shift from section 1 to section 2, we can think of the section 1 with that impersonal, angry narrator focused very, very closely on Riley. I said when we saw the earbud, it's like the camera is shooting him from like 3 feet behind, right, as he goes down the street. Section 2, and yes, it is worth of trying to frame these things in terms of cinematography, because cinematography makes these choices about distance in and out and so forth much more visible, you know, literally visible in a way that stories don't. So section 2 comes to shift on a new character. His name is Brother Man, and Brother Man is the sort of proper English version of this character, Brahman, who we learn more about from other parts of the story. A stock character on the TV show called Martin. It's brought in by Paris, you know, it's Riley's girlfriend, Paris Larkin. She has this passion for 90s culture. She was the one who was watching old reruns of Martin and thinking about the Wish sandwich earlier in the day. I gave you that link. You can get the segments, the segments from the show if you want. So Brahman was a stock character on a show. Brother Man, that's like a slightly cleaned up stock character for a short story. Only then again, the narrator will be concerned to defeat expectations. You thought that we were just going to get a stock kind of villainous thug character? No, we're going to get some select pieces of information about him as well. We're not going to get a fully realistically rendered, deeply psychologically insightful, you know, version of the story like some other genre of short story might be interested in doing. We're not going to get that here. But what we are going to get is a curated selection of sort of data points that together bring home how unique and precious every single human life is, and how the loss of even a single life is an immeasurable loss to the world. So, just as I talk about the language migrating from a character's thoughts into the third person narration, you could also think about the sort of web of knowledge in this story, that the knowledge of Brahman and the extrapolation of this character of Brother Man, it's somehow there, it's anchored in a character's consciousness and personal tastes, but it somehow then becomes available to the story and to the consciousness of the narrator, so that all of these little strands weave together to produce a very, very powerfully integrated kind of environment of aesthetics and politics and consciousness. So what we see here, it's not what I would call conventional external narration. We are not seeing, you know, moments A, B, C, D, and E in chronological order in a story from a middle distance where we see one, then we see the other come together. The story is really avoiding that kind of clearly organized, easily organized narration. Instead, I would describe this narration as exploratory. It is not anchored in a single time and place. It can convey immediacy when it wants to, but it really is written from a place of knowledge in retrospect, right? That all the pieces have been put together in order to make the voice of the narrator possible. So we feel perhaps a little bit that the narrator is reporting after the fact. We don't yet know what the fact will be. Fact, in its root sense, is a made thing. It's from the Latin verb to make, so it's a done thing. And in older English, in 18th century English, fact is the name for a crime in a legal trial. You know, the fact of the, you know, or the facts of the case and so forth. It has a special status. So we keep on being here in the presence of a narrator who is very angry, who is very sarcastic, who is characterized by these frequent meta asides and maybe even an excessive or painful sense of self-awareness, but who refuses to make this story melodramatic. Right? That's the risk of the kind of go deep down into Richard Simmons's childhood and youth and backstory and telling you all the things. It really can become melodramatic or a little bit cheap. Thompson-Spires is able to get the effect that you might get with these just glimpses of popping in, but to also have this sharp, ironic distance that ultimately will be more likely to make us very angry and sad, rather than sort of self-indulgently, you know, identifying and sorry and sad in a more conventional kind of a way. Section 3 now cuts to a totally different scene and a different set of characters. Section 3 is set externally in a particular time and place, but it is happening actually later in the day, like probably, I'm making up a precision, it doesn't have it, but let's imagine it happening like 6 hours later, 5 hours later. How do we know this? Because we know that Kevin, the main character in this scene, he's with his daughter, he's with his toddler, no, 4-year-old daughter. He's the non-custodial parent. He's buying her a vegan purple cupcake, right? Like it's a very ordinary quotidian glimpse of a scene. We see them. He has seen earlier in the day the footage of the outcome of the incident that was the encounter between Riley and Richard Simmons. It's referred to glancingly in the middle. So lots of different things that this section does. It jumps us ahead in time so that it lets the narrator give us a little bit more foreknowledge or foreshadowing of what must have happened by now without quite describing it explicitly. It gives us even a little glimpse of color. Think about the way the purple cupcake picks up those different blues, the blue of Riley's contact lenses and the blue of the Sonic the Hedgehog spikes and so forth at the beginning. You'll often see in short stories, especially, sort of thematic, like colors linking different things together. It's one of the tools that an author has. And among other things, Kevin is the way that the author gets to introduce this key cluster of intertexts that is the 19th century Black writer William Wilson, his pen name, or the sort of the persona that he wrote under, was Ethiop, like Ethiopian, Ethiop, the African-American Picture Gallery. And then this earlier precursor work to that by James McCune Smith that has the whole title that is taken for the title of the story and for the book, Heads of the Colored People, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is another one of the places, like those opening references to The Bluest Eye and Invisible Man, where the author gets to pack a real punch into a small number of words. So let me read you the sentence. I'm just going to read it. It's too distracting to me when I keep on jumping around. I am going to share screen in a minute. Kevin, we've had a paragraph that describes those 19th century periodical works. They're prose sketches. They're not drawings of heads or drawings of character types and their outfits and so forth. The sketch is the name for a prose form as well, had been for a good long while by that point. So in some sense, those sketches, the picture gallery, the heads of the colored people, those are the genre precursor that Thompson-Spires is claiming for her own collection, right? That they're going to be prose sketches of Black people in a society that are like those ones. And then we get this observation by the narrator about Kevin. We're getting the narrator sort of close paraphrase of what Kevin thinks. Kevin wanted to commission painters, including mostly himself, that's a funny little narratorial aside, to create a full exhibit of heads of the colored people, now and then, 21st century, 19th century, to take the written literary work and render it visually. The idea intrigued him. The heads, this is the heads that are the prose sketches, and then the notional drawings that he might, or gallery of artists might create. The heads talking to him like the books in Equiano, though he didn't know that reference yet. Now, I think it's likely that someone in this group, I know a lot of you don't have your cameras on and are probably horrified that I'm now addressing you directly. I have a strong suspicion that there is at least someone in this group who knows who Equiano is and who knows a little bit about the reference of the talking books that Equiano refers to. Does anybody have that to hand and want to unmute yourself and share a rough approximation of it? I'm going to go ahead and share screen because I did find actually a good reference that I should have put into the whatchamacallit, the module. Okay, so this is a random source. It's not like the site is some amazing thing. It's just it happened to have exactly what we wanted. So Auda Equiano, the interesting narrative and other writings. Equiano was the author of one of the first published narratives by a free person who had come out of the experience of slavery, and is the story of his achieving his freedom. It's a really rich and amazing text. A lot of 18th century scholars have become very interested in recent years, but it was relatively neglected, I think, for a lot of the 19th and 20th century. And the talking heads reference, it's really, I think, in some ways less directly a reference to Equiano and more a reference to the emergence of African-American studies in the United States as a field of interest. And this is the foundational book that the talking books in Equiano is kind of, as a reference, is mediated through. Many of you will know the name of Henry Louis Gates, extraordinarily distinguished literary critic, and really one of the powerhouse who was the institutional founder that helped departments of Black and African-American literature kind of spring up at universities all over the United States. So he wrote this very influential book. Non-influential books don't get republished in 25th anniversary editions, called The Signifying Monkey, a theory of African-American literary criticism, a really foundational work. And these are the sentences that he quotes from Equiano, and that the narrator is alluding to here as a reference that Kevin doesn't know yet. that he might come to know later, but he doesn't know yet. I had often seen my master and Dick employed in reading, and I had a great curiosity to talk to the books as I thought they did, and so to learn how all things had a beginning. For that purpose, I have often taken up a book and talked to it, and then put my ears to it when alone in hopes it would answer me, and I have been very much concerned when it remains silent. Now, this is the knowing, wiser, later Equiano, deliberately mobilizing for sort of comic, estranging effect, his youthful failure to understand what it is that writing does, and that reading, and that books don't talk back, that they're not like a person in that sense. And it's important for the argument that Gates is making. You get this little snippet here, right? He was something who was owned, and now by learning to read and write, and by making books accessible to him and his friends, he has brought this sign of subjectivity that is so characteristic of European culture. He has claimed it for himself, the presence of a voice, which is the feature of a face. So it's another way in which in which the narrator is drawing together this extraordinary web of kind of core literary and cultural references in order to position the narrator and the story with all of the knowledge of the sort of, the 50 years of intervening work in African American studies and so forth, to bring that knowledge that the narrator has and that some of us might have as we're reading it, to bring that to bear to make sense of this story, even though the characters in this story may not have these thoughts all fully accessible. So Kevin is connected as part of the discursive world of the story and its commentary, but Kevin is thinking about his project, this vision of the artwork that will be the counterpart to the 19th century periodical, as a way of stopping himself from thinking about what he saw earlier today. And we get the phrase, the sight of two dead bodies that had appeared casually in his news feed. And that is the sideways way that the narrator tells us what is going to be inevitably the outcome of that encounter that we only saw in its early stages. It's this that I'm referring to as more fleshing out or foretelling and so forth. So yes, Kevin's project will touch on police killings of Black men, and that aside, Black women too. We learn from the narrator that afterwards, in the aftermath of this act of violence, Kevin, who doesn't yet know Paris, Riley's girlfriend, will come to know her, and we learn more about how that happens in Paris's section of the story a little bit later on, right? So this is set chronologically later than the first couple sections of the story. We've jumped ahead, and then we're going to go back. And again, by lingering on these details, I want to convey to you the sense in which a story like this is really a kind of a constellation or construction across time and space, not a linear narrative that unfolds in a straightforward way. So section 4, yes, I have my eye on the time. I might have to speed up my delivery rate. Section 4 is Paris's section, back into the time of narration of the main story. The fisticuffs, the scrapping is underway. She is, unbeknownst to herself, physically converging on the same, they were meant to meet up at the conventions. They're very near, so it's not coincidence. They're converging. Paris, like Kevin, there is doubling and superfluity in this story, has a sketchbook that she calls a collection of heads. She's called elsewhere by the narrator a sketch artist. And think of the connection between that phrase and court sketches, right? When cameras are prohibited in court, there may be the presence of a sketch artist who will capture the look of the defendant or the prosecutor or the judge and so forth in these dramatic kind of quickly notated scenes that are one of our other main senses of the sketch. Paris is walking towards some kind of a scene. There's flashing lights, police cars, bystanders. She can't look away. And where she thinks she's going to look down and see something awful, she does, but it's awful in a quite different and additional way than she imagines, because it is her beloved boyfriend, Riley, who is on the ground having been shot by the police. It's not a random stranger at all. And we have that section ending with this rather moving couple sentences that I'll just read you. Years later, so look at how temporally expansive the story is. Years later, she would regret not drawing the offending officer that day. Since then, she has sketched his face over and over, penciling his name and imagining her notebook as a sort of plea, saying it aloud, wishing that she, like Euclid, this necromancer character she's playing, could pronounce the names of those she wanted to die and make it so. And in that simple observation, the author again is giving us, it's so sensitive. If I put it into words, it makes it sound reductive and stupid. It's not powerful anymore. But we are being given another model for what sketches, i.e. these short sketch-like sections of this 6-part story, what sketches might let you do. Sketches as a way of indicting, as a way of killing, as a way of not just memorializing, but actively making that fact into something that will rebound back on the person who committed the violence. So in section 5, the voice then really expands back out. It's almost, there are moments that are like a pastiche of quasi-journalistic reporting. Only in section 5 of a 6-section story do we actually get the description of the incident. That is very late in terms of where it falls in the number of pages, but as I've suggested, it's foreshadowed from the start. So it is ominously hanging over us from quite early on. We have a knowledge that coming to us that something very bad is going to happen. Here again, we see the narrator's refusal to go all in on realistic depiction, to make things fully particular. The political and ethical force of this story, we intuit, comes from the ways that its particularities are subsumed into general truths. Look at this little list. The constants, parenthesis, unarmed men, excessive force, another dead body, another dead body. The repetition of that phrase is just devastating. So here too, it's an amazing skill with which the author gives this narrator the ability to refuse realism, to say that that is a cheap trick. It's associated with the kind of journalism that profits off of death and voyeurism and suffering. It can be sentimental or self-indulgent instead of being sharp and critical in the way that this narrator really is. But still then, the selection, the curation, the notation of a few particular details compatible somehow with that meta suspicion. A few more points I should not leave to the imagination, the narrator says. Those points are the chalk drawing, the outline of the bodies after they've been removed on the sidewalk. The rectangle where Richard might have been holding a laminated comic book mock-up. Blood has stained this whole scene. Griffin's giving a good detail in the chat. You can make sure to read it. Yes, sketchbook to call forth death among others. I think that's another good cultural reference here. Thank you. I know nothing about anime. So the rectangle that is dry, that we see where blood is around it, but the plastic laminated, model or comic book blocked it. And then this amazing technique, very poignant, very effective, that is used in the last part of section 5, the technique of describing a collage of photos. We are never allowed to have a simple, melodramatic, self-indulgent kind of sympathy for those. Right away, there are the breaks of identification, the insistence on the failures of these images to convey the important things. Riley is in costume. It's described. The complexities of Riley's identity, though, don't come through in this at all. His mother and girlfriend, Paris, explained repeatedly that he was not dressed as a thug, but as 90s Justin Timberlake, right? The level of nuance that news reporting on a dead Black man just is absolutely incapable in our world of really conveying. Brother man's mugshot. Both families, the narrator says, would say the pictures didn't say anything, that that's not how anyone who knew them would remember them. brutal, angry, outright statement, and the section ends. There was a failure even to establish how many shots were fired, the exact number of shots. So we're being asked to think at the end of this section about failures of knowledge, the limits of knowledge in the conventional forms of storytelling, both fictional in the sort of like, you know, in a sort of straight, somewhat melodramatic, tragic realism, and also journalistic, where the documentary obsession tips over into voyeurism so easily. And now I just have 6 minutes. I'm going to talk really quickly. So we have a sense of the heads of the colored people and the long history of that genre, the prose sketch, its long history in 19th century African-American periodical culture, that it is allied to a voice that this narrator claims of social critique, of commentary, often witty and sardonic and humorous. And we had that talking book Equiano example as well, real self-awareness about isn't this the narrator who talks back, right? Who the voice here is jumping off the page. And what I want to do now is just take us to the final section of the story. I will do what I can with it. I'm going to share the screen again. And we're going to go there. And I've got the story. We're going to go right to the end. Okay, so the final section comes in two parts, section 6. I think a cop shooting is too melodramatic when the story was interesting on its own. And my preoccupation with race is perhaps overdone. This is almost a personalized narrator now. This sounds like a person talking rather than an impersonal, disembodied narrator. But it was O'Connor, I think, who said, and I say I think here more as a device to affect a sort of nonchalance, when in fact I know she said, everything that rises must converge, or something like that. Serving as another affected clause. Laceratingly self-critical, smart narrator whose anger, who is not perhaps herself insulated from her own anger. But that makes the ending sound intentional or overdetermined when it wasn't. Though I know it was Donica Kelly who said, the way a body makes a road, or in this case, an outline, impression. And if we had a third word in that sequence, it would be sketch, right? Outline, impression, sketch. Gonna race through, I'll send it to you so you can read it at a more leisurely date. The Donica Kelly poem that is quoted here, Arkansas Love Song. Fences break a landscape the way a body makes a road. Somewhere between Memphis and home, the shoulder collects masses of hide and blood and white tendon. The road binds us one to another, and I try to make the binding mean something about forgetting and the failures of resurrection. This is a failure. The disarticulated wing stands for a disarticulated wing. The rusted breast the same. This is not about my mother, another failure. It is about nothing else. So you see that Thompson-Spires has borrowed this extraordinary image, an image that the fences break a landscape the way a body makes a road, with the roadkill on the side of the road moving into the image of the road binding us one to another. You might think there, of course, of Bynum in Joe Turner's Come and Gone. And let me now just read in my last couple minutes the final 2 paragraphs, because these words are really more powerful than anything that I'm going to produce myself. How to end such a story, especially one that is this angry, like a big black fist. The voice is off-putting, all the important action happens off screen. We don't even see the shooting or the actual bodies or the video. Like that one guy in Fiction Workshop said, so this narrator is a writer who's taken fiction workshops and who may indeed have a lot in common with Thompson-Spires. Meta is so 80s. The mise en abîme is cool but overdone. That's the mini version of something inside and ever regressing. This is a story of fragments, sketches, and then the echo of a rejection from a literary magazine. Dear author, thank you for sharing this, but we regret, right, the formula of a rejection. I concede that it might have been so much more readable as a gentle network narrative with the cupcakes and the superheroes and the blue eyes and the 90s image patterning. But I couldn't draw the bodies while the heads talked over me and the mosaic formed in blood. And what is a sketch but a chalk outline done in pencil or words? And what is a Black network narrative but the story of one degree of separation, of sketching the same pain over and over, wading through so much flesh, trying to draw new conclusions, knowing that wishing would not make them so. So, final 2 sentences for me. Fragments, sketches, obliquity, indirection, omission. These are the only way to narrate this story. And here you might think back, the connections aren't obvious, but I hope I've brought you to a place where you can imagine them. Think of Brathwaite's Dream Haiti. Think of Adrian Kennedy's Dreamscape. Think of the omissions, the sheer incomprehensibility of Zong. And think about the value of choosing a mode of representation that resists giving everything and that enacts in its formal properties exactly the things that it is also writing about. That is it for lecture for today. So, yeah, that was intense. This is an intense story. Go and read it again if you read it once. You know, it's just, you couldn't read it often enough. So I'll stay on for a couple minutes. I would be happy to have some more conversation about the other stories if we can find a little time. It will be completely casual. It will not be an attempt to replace seminar, but maybe I'll send around an email to see if there's a Friday, if there's a time or that makes sense, or if you're interested, you could send me an email and then I'll see if there's a schedule. And I will continue to experiment with what we do on the module pages, but I had already guessed that it would be what I can see on one screen in terms of attendance here. It's thank you for being here. It's much easier for me to focus when I have a live audience. So I think I'll put this in the module that we might try and have some conversation in lecture next week. You know, not have it be lecture, but have it be more a hybrid of some lecture and some discussion. It's a pity not to use some of the time for that. So I will be in touch by email, and I thank you all for your attention. And I will see you next week, if not before.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was incredible.
You can tell that like fiction is my home. Isn't that funny? Yeah, I'm really glad that you all shared the commitment to the story that I have too.
That was really great.
Good. Thanks, Erica. Isn't it just an amazing story?
Yes, and I see your cat loved it because here he comes.
Yeah, he's just coming in to say hello. That's kind of nice. I saw Betsy's cat a minute ago too, didn't I?
Oh yes, he's behind me.
Yeah.
Jenny, can I just make one really quick observation?
Please do.
Your lecture was so great and kind of got me diving into all the layers of the story. The thing about the grainy video, I just couldn't stop thinking about like what a watershed moment Rodney King was, right? Like, and the fact that, videos don't tell the whole story. And how, when you think about, like documentation of crimes like that before and after video cameras and now cell phones, the description of the grainy video on the TV is so kind of post Rodney King, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
All right. I have yoga at 5:30 to wind me back
okay.
down after having gotten myself super revved up for lecture. It's a good way I've structured my Wednesdays this semester, but I'll talk to all of you some more. I'd love to talk some more about these stories. So we'll either do small group or some office hours or something like that. I'll see you all really soon.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
So much.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.